and do that. I think that's a new feature from Zoom, this little announcement. So recording is in process. Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Jonas Cartano. I'm from Third Eye Cultural Collaborative, and I've been working with Lisa Simmons from Mass Cultural Council on this series of 4 webinars about festival audiences over this summer. This is the second webinar of the 4 this summer. The previous one was on June 15th, and it was entitled Festivals and Your Audiences, Emerging from the Pandemic. And I also wanted to remind you to save the date on future webinars. I'm just going to dump them into the chat here. So we've got 2 coming up. On July 22nd, we'll talk about data collection for festivals. And then on August 6th, we're thinking about another possible topic, so that'll be announced in the future. Okay. And once again, as I mentioned, these webinars are being recorded and will be posted onto Mass Cultural Council's YouTube page eventually. As for today, Angela, I think we can go ahead and get started with sharing your screen there. Just to set expectations, I wanted to let you know that we've divided today's program into 2 sections. And in the first section, Angela Hahn will provide an overview of what's available in the Festivals Toolkit. I'm going to pop the link of the Festivals Toolkit into the chat, just so it's nice and easy and accessible for you. First, we'll cover the background of the project and how the toolkit kind of came into being. And then, most importantly, we'll talk about what's inside the toolkit. The toolkit was intended as a guide for festival producers like yourselves to improve audience development and engagement. At the end of this first section, we'll take a pause and answer questions. But throughout the whole presentation this morning, we'd love to encourage you to just type in questions into the chat function. And then we'll address them at the end of each section. So we've got this first section with a toolkit overview. And then in the second section, we'll take you through one of kind of the foundational exercises in the toolkit, the identifying your audiences exercise. We believe that in order to improve audience development and engagement, you first need to be able to articulate who your audience currently is, how you want it to develop, and then that will really shape how you can think about strategies and effectively engaging that audience or those audiences if there's more than one audience. And just as a reminder, we're going to be using the chat function and also may add in some polls. So if you need to organize your screens to be able to watch the screen and the chat, please go ahead and do so. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Angela Hahn to you. She and I are co-founders and partners at Third Eye Cultural Collaborative, working with the Mass Cultural Council and ArtsBoston on this project. Her experience in the nonprofit cultural sector has included local and national organizations, and she's worked as an executive director for an orchestra. She's a science educator for a museum and also a policy researcher. And most important for today's discussion, she was also the lead project manager in developing the Festivals Toolkit with the Mass Cultural Council Festivals program. And with that, I'm going to let Angela take it away from here.
Great, thanks, Jonas. So I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to see the folks in the room and to learn a little bit actually about who's in this room and what they think they could get out of this toolkit. Kind of what their thoughts are about marketing and audience development, and what you feel like you need actually to really improve your work. So to just start off, I thought what would be really nice is if you could, the people in the room could just take a moment to introduce yourselves, and we'll just do this over the chat function. And you're welcome to share kind of any and all of the following, your name, the name of the festival that you're with, where that is, when your next festival is going to be, and that could be TBD for some of you, and then also just what the current status of your festival is, since I imagine many of you are kind of in the process or have had to make shifts to your festival planning this last year. What you think the next event is going to be is going to look like, right? We have one person at the very beginning share that they're going to keep theirs virtual, for right now at least. But yeah, if you're doing virtual, in person, or something mixed, it's just helpful for us to understand that, and just understand a little bit better about who's in the room. So Jonas, actually, if you want to just pop those questions in the chat, um, that would be.
Already there.
Oh, you did. Okay. You are so much better than me about managing chats. So what I wanted to do today, like Jonas said, is I wanted to talk a little bit about Audience Lab. What is Audience Lab? And kind of what does it have to do with you? Why are we here talking to festivals about Audience Lab? And a little bit more context. Audience Lab is a project of ArtsBoston, and Jonas and I are not. We're consultants who were hired by ArtsBoston when they first started developing Audience Lab. We actually worked on some very specific research pieces of the project. There was some marketing research that they hired us to do. And then in this last year, as ArtsBoston has been in transition, we've been supporting, as Jonas said, as basically project managers for the program. So even though we're not on staff at ArtsBoston, we're certainly very intimately familiar with Audience Lab, and what this looks like. And then we've done a lot of work with the festivals who are involved in Audience Lab this last year. So Audience Lab actually started back in 2016 as a program conceived by ArtsBoston. And the intention was to help build audience diversity in the greater Boston arts and cultural sector. So the idea was to disrupt marketing practices, trying to find innovative ways to market the arts using collaboration and data-informed experimentation. Back in 2016, when they initially conceived of this program, they started with a cohort of 10 Boston performing arts organizations who were particularly interested in addressing the lack of racial and ethnic diversity in their audiences. So these were organizations that had, I would say, primarily white audiences. Typically, the typical organization in this cohort had a primarily white audience that was older, and they were trying to understand how and why and what they needed to do to diversify their audiences, and in particular from a marketing standpoint. Audience Lab is actually inherently an experiment. It was conceived of as an experiment. The organizations within the cohort were asked to experiment. Everything about it is experimental. And so in a lot of ways, what gets learned through Audience Lab then informs changes to Audience Lab itself. And also, ultimately, arts and cultural organizations, and actually also eventually ArtsBoston as well. It's really intended to disrupt biased marketing systems and to try out tools and strategies that are inclusive, but again, are experimental and new to the arts sector or to the organizations who are testing them out. Audience Lab is built on ArtsBoston's core strengths and their core business practices. So for those of you who aren't familiar with ArtsBoston, it's a service organization that really provides support in terms of marketing and audience development for arts organizations in the greater Boston area. They have access to a lot of data and actually provide a lot of data, database and also data tools for their members, particularly in terms of marketing and audience development. And so the focus of Audience Lab is really built on those concepts. Another key characteristic of Audience Lab is the cohort experience. So the opportunity for a small group of organizations to meet regularly, to learn together and to test out ideas together. This cohort experience was really embedded as a part of Audience Lab because the idea of trying out new things, it's often better to try out new things with others so you can learn from each other and have that peer learning process. But it's also important because these are new things and maybe a little bit challenging. It's important to be able to build that trust. And so having really a cohort experience where you could build relationships and have trust with the people that you're learning with and experimenting with was something that they realized from the outset was something that was really important. So the one of the I would say one of the core ideas behind Audience Lab was actually to take tools that were already being used. So there are tools that are already being used in the civic engagement space that Arts Boston felt could be applied to audience diversification in the arts. Um, there are two partners in this effort. We've got the Massachusetts Voter Table, which is a nonprofit that works to increase civic engagement in communities of color across Massachusetts. And then there's a shop called Clarity Campaign Labs. And this is actually a modeling and statistical analysis shop. And they do a lot of data analysis support about voters. So just understanding voter demographics, in particular for Democratic and progressive campaigns. These are, I would say there's a lot of work that's done in the civic engagement space in terms of using data and understanding voters that is analogous to what people working in the arts want to understand about their audiences or their potential audiences. And then in addition to that, actually in particular, a lot of the organizations that the Massachusetts Voter Table works with actually look very similar to smaller community-based arts organizations. You know, many of these are community-based organizations. In terms of organizational structure, they might be a little bit smaller. They don't have a lot of capacity to do things like understand data. And so the Mass Voter Table is actually really instrumental in helping these types of organizations understand, you know, what is the profile of the type of person that you're trying to talk to or work with, and how can we help you use data to be able to leverage your resources to the best way possible. And while, you know, that's true of any organization, I think in particular, smaller organizations really need that kind of support to be able to leverage their resources very effectively. You know, starting back in 2016, Arts Boston just started, you know, really started understanding what is it that these two shops do and how can we take that and turn it into something analogous for the Audience Lab context. I mentioned when Audience Lab started, it started with a cohort of 10 Greater Boston arts organizations. These were, I would say, you know, I would describe them as kind of mid-sized to large organizations. They included organizations like Arts Emerson, American Repertory Theater, World Music Crash Arts, Huntington Theater, Jose Mateo Ballet. So these were, I would say, you know, these were organizations that, you know, have physical spaces that sold tickets. And invited people to come into their spaces. That's kind of the typical way that they recruit audiences and what it is that they want to do with them. In 2019, Arts Boston and the Mass Cultural Council started talking about what Arts Boston was learning from Audience Lab, and actually how this might be applicable to festivals, and what kind of programming shifts and what kind of experience festivals might need in order to be able to think about audience diversification and expanding audiences in a way that was really effective for people like the people that we have in the room today. So in 2019, we were brought in, you know, myself, Jonas, and then our third colleague, Allison, we were brought in to and asked to manage this experience. So take what was learned from this original cohort, and then revise it in a way that made sense for festivals, because that's a slightly different type of organization. So before I get into talking about kind of what that looked like, I'm wondering actually if we could launch a poll. It looks like a number of you have introduced yourselves through the chat, and I really appreciate that. And then we've just got a couple of other questions about your festival that we thought we could ask you in a poll. So if you could just take a moment and answer a few of these questions. Right, and we'll give you maybe another 30 seconds. It looks like several of you have responded already. Okay, and then Jonas, do you have the ability to close the poll, right? Okay. Okay.
So close the poll. Would you like to see the results?
Yeah, let's share the results.
Sure.
Okay, great. So this is great to see. It's great to see, and it's great to just understand a little bit more about the festivals that are in the room. So it looks like, it looks like there's a mix of people who've got paid staff, some volunteers in terms of planning your festival, and some of you have got both paid staff and volunteers, which I think is a pretty typical setup. It looks like about 2/3 of you are entirely free, but then the rest of you offer some kind of paid event or ticketed event. And it looks like 2/3 of you are part of a larger organization. So that is great to see. So when we launched Audience Lab Festivals in 2019, we actually worked with the Mass Cultural Council to recruit a cohort of 10 festivals. And the idea was to have a cohort of 10, I would say fairly diverse and mixed festivals. So as you can see here, we had festivals from all across Massachusetts. There was a mix of all of the questions that I just asked. Some of them were free, entirely open events. Some of them were ticketed in seats, in venues with seats type of events. Some of them were embedded within larger organizations and had paid staff that were able to support them. Some of them were 100% volunteer run. And so it was a really, I would say, a good mix of festivals and types of organizational structures to implement these festivals. And so we worked with this cohort over the course of a year to implement the concepts of Audience Lab and to work with them to improve their audience engagement and diversify their audiences. In terms of participating in Audience Lab, over the course of the year, we took this cohort through an experience that included peer learning opportunities. And so up here, we've just got the schedule of what they went through. It was a year-long cohort-based experience with 9 of their peers. They received training in arts marketing practices, and they, in particular, we provided training on topics that included social media, audience data collection, and also audience development and audience engagement. And the particular topics that we chose actually were really based on what we learned about festivals. There had been some interviewing and recruiting that we had done with a number of festivals prior to starting the program. And so we really want to understand what are the specific topics and what are the particular aspects of those topics that festivals need to understand. There was a marketing experiment that was planned. And so the festivals who participated in this cohort also received some financial support to implement this experiment. For those festivals that were already doing things like collecting audience data, we actually provided a demographic analysis. Clarity Campaign Labs, one of the ways that they provide support to Audience Lab actually is doing this demographic analysis. And again, interestingly, from their perspective, it's very similar to the kind of analysis that they might offer a campaign, a political campaign, but they were doing it for audiences in the arts. And then just in general, they received support from ArtsBoston, just getting some expertise in audience data and audience building practices. Not as an unplanned part of the experience, in March 2020, we actually realized that we had to shift what it was that we had planned for this particular cohort. So you can see here, starting in March, we started doing some check-in meetings about what was happening with festivals, what was happening just with the status of their planning in general. And so we shifted for a little bit, but we did keep the focus on marketing to allow people to continue to think about what their marketing practices look like and what they wanted to do in terms of audience development and audience diversification moving forward. One of the things that we realized and that the Mass Cultural Council realized is that, this is a really great experience for 10 festivals, but there are hundreds of festivals across Massachusetts. There are hundreds of grantees in the festivals program, and in fact, there are probably more festivals than that across Massachusetts. And so providing this kind of customized cohort experience was not really possible for everyone. And so one of the outputs that we created as a part of this experience is the toolkit that we're going to talk about today. And it's just a way to provide resources and support to all the hundreds of festivals across Massachusetts through I would say, a venue or a medium that's just more accessible to everyone rather than trying to go through what is a fairly labor-intensive cohort process. So we're gonna jump into the toolkit now, and essentially the toolkit was built to mirror the Audience Lab Festival's experience, which is why I spent a couple of minutes just talking through that. The content that's in there really mirrors the experience that people received. We've got some videos actually in the toolkit, which are really recordings of the trainings that some of the that festivals received over the course of the year, and so. So that's why I just wanted to go through and talk about what festivals experienced, because the toolkit is essentially our attempt at trying to provide people with that experience through something that's a little bit less labor intensive, like I said. So the toolkit here, I've just got a screenshot of the website. It's up on the Mass Cultural Council website, and if you go to the festivals area, you can see it. And it's broken up into a couple different sections. And again, this was, like I said, this was meant to mirror the experience, but it's also meant to mirror what we've learned through Audience Lab is important for festivals to think about when they think about marketing and when they think about audience development. And so the very first exercise actually that we asked people to go through in the toolkit, I really stress to not skip it, but to start with it. The first section, Understanding Your Needs, is actually a set of exercises. It's a set of open-ended discussions or open-ended questions that are intended to provoke discussion. We really strongly recommend that you go through them as a team with whoever makes strategic marketing decisions in your group, right? So that could be the people that plan your marketing for the year, the people that are on site who are actually surveying audiences who come to your festival, the people who are actually working to create the social media ads or any other kind of advertising that you might have or do that placement, and the people who are actually trying to build community through social media or through other channels before your event itself. And the idea is to just really talk through and think about what is the kind of marketing work that you already do? What is the kind of data that you already collect? And is it actually meeting your goals? Who is it that you're trying to target? Are your actions and your activities actually hitting the kinds of people that you want to target in terms of your particular festival? And so the toolkit starts off with this series of discussion questions for a group of people to talk about, to talk through as a way to really just, I would say, just set the framing for what we'd like you to do. Oh, oops. And I accidentally hit the down button with my notebook. If it's just one of you that does the marketing, I would encourage you to use this as an opportunity to actually recruit some other people to work on marketing and think through strategy and do planning with you, to be able to do this as a group, because I think thinking through this as with at least one other person is actually really valuable. I actually just want to pause and see, Jonas, if there's anything else that you want to add to this and the value that we see in starting off with discussion.
No, I was just typing into the chat that, having these sorts of discussion questions are really a good way to help all of your volunteers or your marketing team get onto the same page about what you want next year's festival to look like. Not just in terms of audiences, but what are the big talking points about your festival that you want to communicate out to everybody, and who are those audiences? I think that's the biggest piece, which we'll talk about a little bit later as well.
Yep. Okay, so this understanding your needs section of the toolkit is like I said, really setting the framework, thinking about strategy and planning. But then there's a couple of building knowledge sections that we've got in the toolkit, and those are very practical. You know, what we heard, one thing that we heard from festivals is, you know, we've got limited capacity and we don't necessarily have the skills that we think we need to do X, Y, and Z particular marketing topics. And so there are a couple of specific building knowledge topics that we put together and are in the toolkit. First one is social media. You know, that's something that we heard kind of loud and clear from everyone, was that they could use some support with social media. And so we've got a chapter with very practical ideas for improving your social media practices. Focuses on Facebook and Instagram, because those just tend to be the platforms that are the most useful for festivals. And in there, you know, we've just got a couple of guides. If you've got 3 hours that you can spend on your social media, here's a list of things that you should start off doing. You know, things like make sure that your photos are optimized for posting on Facebook and Instagram. Make sure that you've got kind of a standard stock set of language and photos that you can use whenever you're posting in any of these places, so it's easy to grab those kinds of items. Make sure you've got logos and links in all of the appropriate places, so your all of your social media activity is linked back to your website, and your website is linked to your social media activity. So those are just, I would say, very practical ways to get started for people who are new to social media, or just feel like that they're not very comfortable with it. And then there's some more, I would say, some more nuanced or in-depth strategies about social media, things like frequency around posting, posting length, posting content, things like that. So if you've got a little bit more time, or if you're a little bit more social media savvy, there's also information in there with just some basic guidelines that you can use when you are posting to Facebook and Instagram, but I think this is also applicable to other platforms if there's other platforms that you're using. The second building knowledge topic is around audience data collection. Again, since we are talking about Audience Lab as a really data-driven and data-based experience, in particular for festivals, learning about your audiences and being able to collect data from your audiences is really important. Here, we actually, this chapter is based on content provided by the Mass Voter Table. I mentioned up at the beginning, a lot of the types of organizations the Mass Voter Table works with look very similar to festivals in terms of kind of their organizational structure, the resources that they have at hand, and also some of the constraints that they have. And so here, again, I would say we really started off talking about what are some really simple ways to go about collecting data from your audiences, even if you feel that you're in a context that's really challenging to do that. You know, in the poll, I noticed 2/3 of you are free events. I would imagine many of you have got fairly open setups, so that it's not necessarily easy to intercept people as they come in and collect data, but there are some easy strategies that you can use to do that. And so this chapter goes into that and talks about that. I've actually put up one of the survey forms, or one of the response forms that the Mass Voter Table uses, which is a very simple postcard format. That is a paper postcard that they use at many of their events. But again, it doesn't have to be complicated or long for it to be useful. This is a pretty simple setup that, you know, even though this in particular is about, again, progressive issues, political issues, it's something that actually a lot of the festivals in the cohort saw as a very good example that they could take and modify to use for their own particular situations. Final kind of building knowledge topic was around audience engagement. Just what is audience engagement, how to get started, how to take into account issues like accessibility, making sure that you are actually accessible, and what you're doing is accessible for all audiences. And here, this is built on a session where we invited the Boston Book Festival and the Greater Philadelphia Cultural Alliance to talk about their audience engagement practices. And given the timing of this particular content that we offered, we also spent some time just talking about, you know, how to make shifts if you're moving from physical to virtual space or vice versa. The Boston Book Festival in particular was really experimenting with different ways of doing audience engagement that I would say have previously been in person or physical, and were now being moved to the virtual space. So I think a lot of just really great examples of what they were doing. And again, ideas of how to get started, but then also ideas of how to further that if you've already got some audience engagement underway. Audience Lab, I said, is inherently an experiment. And so one of the things that is built into the cohort experiences is conducting marketing experiments. And so we had actually set up an experiment for festivals to do using social media. So we essentially provided a structure for people to set up an experiment on Facebook. And this did a couple of different things. One, we basically encouraged people to be a little bit more structured and strategic with posting Facebook content. So doing that, which would ideally increase their engagement, but then would also actually allow them to collect data and understand whether or not those efforts were successful. And that was really the crux of the experiment. And so we set this up. I will say, just again, in the context of the cohort, we weren't really able to implement it because of the timing of the shutdown of everything happening in 2020. But the experiment itself is something that a lot of festivals were actually planning on doing this year because we had set it up for them, and we had actually coached them in how to set it up, how to do the analysis, how to implement all of the activities. And so that's something that we've got in the toolkit, and I think is something that's actually a little bit unique. I'm not sure if this is something that you could find anywhere else. So if you're interested in doing any kind of experimentation and understanding how you can test out marketing ideas, this is a fairly easy way to do it. You do need a little bit of a budget, but I would say you could start off with as little as $50 to $100 to spend experimenting on your marketing. And so if you can find a little bit of room in your budget, this is actually a good way to get started with trying out marketing experiments. And then we've got a section in the toolkit that's around whether or not you should go virtual. I would say kind of more broadly, this this is a section to help you understand if there are significant shifts you need to make to your festival activities. How can you go through that decision-making process? So we shared examples from 3 of your peers who went through this process last year, what their decision-making looked like, what were the different factors that they took into account, and then what ultimately happened. And these 3 case studies, they were picked in part because actually each festival chose to do something different. One of these festivals chose to just cancel their festival for the year. Another one tried to move it to be completely virtual and to actually really emulate a lot of aspects of their festival just in the virtual world. And then a third festival did move to virtual, but they were very selective in what they were moving to virtual and how they were implementing that. So it's a helpful, I would say these are case studies that are helpful to look at if you realize you need to make major decisions or major shifts to the work that's happening. So I'm just going to pause here and see, Jonas, if there's any questions that make sense to talk through right now.
Yeah, there are a couple of questions put into the chat, and I invite others to also put into the chat, or maybe we can also pose verbally since we're a small group. So let me get to the questions in the chat first. Genevieve was asking, do you keep tips, the social media tips up to date, given that both Instagram and Facebook change the algorithm quite frequently?
So this toolkit, the toolkit we put together a couple of months ago, and I would say as of right now, it's a static document. But I think if you were to give feedback to Lisa or to the Mass Cultural Council staff in general, give them feedback or give them requests to have it updated, then that's something that they could think about addressing.
Yeah, and I from my perspective, I think, some of the things about social media that are in the toolkit are more kind of how you think about social media in general. And, talking about kind of engagement, but also sponsored content. which of course, those algorithms tend to heavily favor, and will probably continue to favor moving forward. So, in terms of getting eyeballs onto your content, I think there's some tried and true social media stuff that you can look at, including using lots of photos and videos where applicable rather than text only updates, thinking about sponsored content or amplifying content in certain ways. Yeah, I think those algorithms will continue to change. So it's going to be tricky to try to game the system because those things will be quickly out of date, unfortunately, as they shift and change. Genevieve also had another question around data collection. So do you have examples of data collection for a festival that happens to be outdoors and is free, such as volunteers walking around with clipboards in a simple form? Maybe you can talk a little bit about what some of those festivals were thinking about, Angela.
Yeah, so I think, so that's a great question. And Genevieve, as you can imagine, a lot of the festivals we work with who had open events like that were really challenged to think about how to capture data from their audiences. I think, so that form that I pulled up, that's one example that was shared that a lot of festivals were thinking about using and incorporating into their event. I think also in the toolkit, there's a couple of examples of how people were thinking about incentivizing audience data collection. So we're going to go through at the end, we're going to go through an audience development activity. And there's a couple of examples of that we have in the toolkit where I feel like the festivals were actually fairly creative about thinking of ideas. So, we had one who was actually thinking about an art activity that would encourage people to stop at a specific place, engage with them. And in fact, that activity was about asking people about their geography, where they were coming from. And so even though that's not I wouldn't say they were necessarily going to be able to collect a lot of really systematic information. It was a really creative way for them to engage with the audience, encourage them to stop, and encourage them to tell them at least a little bit of information about their geography, because they're that festival is very particularly interested in understanding other people from outside the town that are coming into the festival.
Fantastic. Genevieve says she likes the idea of incentivizing and incorporating it into one of the arts activities. And then I think I also remember, just in terms of data collection, I remember some festivals doing on-site data collection, like at a table that people can stop by, maybe incentivizing visitation at that table somehow with a giveaway. And then also heard examples about doing a registration form of some sort. So before the festival, gathering data and even if it's not a required registration, it could be a sort of optional registration for free festivals.
Yep, and actually, I should actually mention the marketing experiment section in the toolkit. One of the things that we talk about and give an example of is how to set up an Eventbrite page. So if you want to ticket your event, regardless of whether or not you actually need tickets, you can still ticket your event. And so I think almost all of the festivals, when before they ended up canceling their events, almost all of the festivals, and in particular the free ones, were thinking about how to set up an Eventbrite page and ticket their event. And the benefit of that is that you've got people who are you've got people who are saying whether or not they're interested in coming beyond, maybe liking your Facebook event. And then you also have the ability of collecting a little bit of demographic information from them. And then, you could either just leave it at that, or you could find ways to incentivize people at the event itself, right? If they come with the Eventbrite ticket and they come to a check-in table, you can collect a little bit more information from them that way. And if you think of a way to incentivize that, that could also drive participation and more audience data collection. So I would encourage you to actually look at that. We actually set up a fake Eventbrite page, so you can actually go through and sign up for a ticket, and you can actually see what kind of information we set up as a model for you to collect.
Great. And so that Eventbrite page or that Eventbrite information is in the examples area. Is that
Yep.
correct?
Yeah, it's in the marketing experiment description.
Oh, marketing experiment.
Yep.
Yeah. So, we've kind of talked a bit about the Festivals Toolkit. And I've put in the link into the chat a few different times, but encourage you to kind of explore these different sections to think about, some of the things that you're doing in terms of engaging your audiences and collecting data. And looking at social media practices. So there's a lot of information there, and we tried to organize it in these big groups. But of course, it's all also overlapping in terms of topics. So, setting up an Eventbrite group is in the conducting marketing experiment section, but that's a really great way to collect data. So, I think there's a lot of overlap in some of these topics. So we encourage you to just go ahead and click through and read more where those links in the toolkit. Angela, we wanted to shift over into the second section of the presentation to look at this identifying your audiences exercise, because we think it's so important. Why did we want to take a look at this section?
Yeah, so I mentioned up at the top, there's this part about just understanding your needs that we think is really important to spend some time thoughtfully discussing, and discussing with the people in your organization or the people who put on your festival who really think about strategy, and in particular strategy around marketing, around audience diversification, around audience engagement. And essentially, it's a set of open-ended questions intended to provoke discussion. And there's I would say two sets of questions or two sets of exercises that we ask you to go through. And the one that I'm going to actually talk through for the next few minutes is the one that we call identify your audiences. I think Jonas and I we have, we've got experience working with a lot of different arts organizations and a lot of different cultural nonprofits. And I think one perennial sticking point that a lot of these organizations have is it's difficult for them to just think through and articulate in a really specific way, what does our audience look like? I think especially for those of us who work in the nonprofit sector, who are very community or who are very community based, you think, well, everybody wants to come and experience what it is that I have to offer. I think while that's that's a lovely thought, it's difficult to turn that into a strategy or executable actions. And so really just thinking through, what is the kind of person that you're looking to engage with who would most benefit from the kind of work that you're doing. There's value in doing that and just thinking through that. So given the amount of time we have left, we had actually, Jonas and I had originally been thinking about trying to have a little bit of back and forth conversation with you and have you actually work through this exercise with us. But I think right now, maybe I'll just talk through it. Jonas, I think, is going to drop a couple of prompts in the chat. If you want to respond to them, that actually would be quite lovely. And we're happy to have a little back and forth with you. But I'm probably going to just talk through a lot of these.
I think that makes sense. And I've also included the link to these questions for folks to work through by themselves as well, or with your planning teams.
Yep. Yeah. And then we were going to do a poll just asking you who works on your marketing. I wonder, Jonas, should we just do that as a Zoom chat?
Sure.
Yeah. So if you wouldn't mind just putting in the Zoom chat, just so we understand a little bit better, who works on your marketing? Who works on your marketing strategy? And by strategy, I mean, who works on kind of planning out for the year or for, the couple of months leading up to the festival, what your marketing is going to look like, when it's going to happen, what channels it's going to happen. Who does that kind of planning? Is it just you? Is there a team of you? Is there a committee of staff and or volunteers who work on this? Are they people who've got marketing expertise? And then also who works on actually implementing the marketing? Who does the ad placement? Who designs the ads? Who manages the social media? Again, in the months leading up to your festival or during the festival itself. It's just helpful for us to know things like that. Those are the kinds of people that we think should go through this discussion and go through this activity. And so in terms of identifying your audiences, like I said, this is just a set of open-ended questions. And we start off pretty big picture. We just ask you to think about what's your mission statement. For those of you in larger organizations, you might have a larger mission statement that you're working towards, or you might actually have something that's very particular for your event. But just thinking through, what is your mission statement? What is it that you're hoping to accomplish? And what I've done is I've actually pulled up an example from the toolkit, and this comes from an actual festival who was in the cohort and worked with us and actually participated in this activity with us when we ran it as an in-person exercise. And so I'm just going to use them as an example so that you can see how one of your peers actually responded to this activity. So this particular festival is a free event located downtown, so it's outdoors. I want to say this is the last time they ran it in person. It was a 5,000 person festival in a fairly small town. So it's a pretty active event. This is the mission statement that they've got. And I think starting from your mission statement is really important because, again, this is a way to set the framing for the work that you do and to really think about, what's the direction that you want your efforts to head in. Then the next question is really around thinking about the audiences. So, I would say both the people that are already coming to your event, but the people that you think you'd like to have come to your event. And, just brainstorm. This is really a brainstorming free-for-all, but just think about all of the different ways you can describe the people who come to your event or who you'd like to have come to your event, right? What kind of art do they like? What kind of social activities do they participate in? Are there specific issues or topics that they care about? Where do they come from, right? Since we're talking about a place-based event for many of you, there are festivals who are very interested in really having people directly from their community. And then there are other festivals that are really interested in having people from outside their community. And so, what is that? Where are people coming from? Is there anything about their demographics that you either know or you would like to know or that you think make up your audience? And then are they familiar with your work? Some of the festivals that we worked with, they were, I would say, they were very interested in attracting people who were very familiar with the type of art form that they were practicing. And then there were other festivals who actually wanted, who were very intentional in wanting to bring in people who were unfamiliar with what they did, because this was kind of their gateway introduction to the particular art form or cultural practice that they were focusing on for their festival. So then again, using the example from the festival that worked through this activity with us last year, these were some of the phrases that they used to describe the people who came or the people who they wanted to see in their audiences. I would say all of this was a festival that actually provides multimedia, contemporary and interactive art activities. They certainly have partner dance as a part of their part of their events. They had good food, or at least I assume the food was good, and they had live music. So these were all things that were already embedded in their event, and that they assumed that people looked for when they came. The next thing that we ask you to do, let me go back up. So this list, I mean, it can be a long list and it can really be just a brainstorming list, right? It doesn't have to be anything organized in any way, but just different ways of describing the people who are coming or who you think would want to come. But then we ask you to actually shift and think of, with a little bit more specificity, how can you group these people, the different descriptors that you've used? How can you group people into smaller subgroups? How can you put them into audience segments that are manageable ways for you to focus on audience? And so, if you could describe up to 3 different segments audience segments that come to your event, and do it in a way that's a little bit more formal. And again, I'll just show you examples from this particular festival. So they identified 3 audience groups. And this first one has a geographic focus. So people who live in that town, live or work in that town, right? So they're familiar with the town, they want to support the town. The second audience group they identified were people who live outside the town. So people who aren't necessarily familiar, but who they thought, would fit maybe some of the descriptors that they had brainstormed in that previous question. And then the last audience group, they described differently, not about geography, right? But a more diverse group of individuals who are maybe socioeconomically a little bit lower. And one thing I want to point out is that this third group overlaps with the first and second, and that's okay. You don't have to split people into like completely separate groups. It's just that you're describing and focusing on different audience groups in a particular way that helps you understand how to connect with them, and how to develop different strategies to connect with them. So for the purposes of this exercise, and I think, this festival in general felt that what they wanted to do was they really wanted to focus on this last audience group. This festival has got fairly limited resources to think about marketing and audience diversification. And so they realized we can only think about one, focus on one group right now. And so for kind of the next question, and then in thinking through their marketing strategy for the year, they realized we want to focus on this group, the racial and ethnically diverse individuals who are currently living at or below the poverty line, and don't necessarily have access to arts and cultural programming. And so we asked them to draft an audience development goal around this particular group, because they felt like this was the one that they wanted to focus on this year. And so what they said is that they wanted to increase the number of people coming from that particular audience group. And then what we did is we actually asked them to, this is a great first draft of an audience development goal, but then we actually challenged people to think through and discuss an articulation of the goal that is measurable, and something that they could actually collect audience data about. And so there's actually a couple of questions that we ask you to think through that aren't up here, but are really around that. How can you collect data to understand whether or not more of that audience is coming, like you say you want? Do you have the ability to do that? If you don't have the ability to do that, can you develop the ability to do that? And so this festival actually then revised their goal. So you've got something that's more measurable, and measurable in a way that they think they can measure, that they could measure about their audience in the next year. And so this is how they revised their goal and articulated it in a more specific way. So I'm gonna pause. I think we're at the end of this activity. But if you go in the toolkit, you'll see the questions actually laid out for you. And actually the questions, there's a longer set of questions. So something that's a little bit more specific to help you get to kind of this place. And also think about how can we actually measure success in terms of this audience development goal. But Jonas, I'm just gonna actually pause here. And let you see if there's any questions, and actually just wrap up this session.
Sure. Yeah, once again, I just reshared where this exercise is on the website. And I think the big broad goal of this exercise is to kind of take you from your mission statement, which is, kind of your base, what your guiding star is, and then asks you to kind of think about your ideal audience off of that mission statement. Who is your core audience? And then try to think about kind of smaller subgroups and segments of those audiences, and then try to think about what your goals are around audience development. So really trying to dig in, like Angela said, so many of our events are open to everybody. Sometimes we default to having that as our audience goal. but it's really hard to market for everybody. What you want to do is have some specificity, so that you're able to better understand, who is coming to the festival, who do you want at the festival, and if there's some sort of gap there, um, encourage you to think about how to address that gap in some sort of way. And in those audience goals, you want to think about, how to develop that audience and what sort of data you want to collect along the way in order to better understand whether you're achieving that goal. So, that's kind of the broad outline of that exercise. And hopefully that's been helpful for you. We didn't have any questions coming in about this section, although we had a lot of folks sharing kind of their structures of how strategies are coming up, how they develop strategies within their festival team, and then also how it's implemented. So, a good number of folks have a partner or two to think about strategies, but often actually a good portion of us were working through the implementation ourselves, or maybe with an intern or like a half-time sort of or a part-time staff member, that sort of person. So for the most part, these are festival producers who do a lot of marketing themselves.
Okay. Okay, so that's just great input for us to have, and just to understand who's kind of who might make use of this toolkit, and just making sure that we have good aim. I would also, for those of you working alone, I would really encourage you to recruit a thought partner. I think sometimes it's hard to recruit the implementation partner, right? So you might be stuck doing all the social media posting, but just having someone else to think through strategy, I think is really valuable.
Yeah, exactly. It sounds like most people do have the thought partner, but the implementation is often up to them. That makes sense. So, we're at time, and just wanted to send out a note of appreciation for your time this morning. Hopefully this has been helpful to orient you around some of the resources available in the Festivals Toolkit and on that website. If you'd like to save the chat, please go ahead and do so now in the chat area. There's those three dots, and you should have an option to save that chat. There's a few links there, and that's might be possible. But all of those links, I think, go right back to the Festivals Toolkit, which was on the festivals portion of the MCC site. And again, as a reminder, the video will be posted onto Mass Cultural Council's YouTube page. And I just put in the link there. And then wanted to remind you that the next webinar will be on July 22nd, and that'll be about data collection specifically. So, if your interest was piqued about, when we were discussing how to gather and look at audience data earlier this morning, be sure to hold that date of July 22nd, 10 a.m. On your calendar. Any parting thoughts, Angela, as we finish things up?
No, thanks everyone for joining us.
Yeah. Thank you again, and look forward to hearing great news about your upcoming festivals in the future. Thanks, everybody. We'll sign off.
Bye.
Bye.